Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the second distinguished lecture of the Tata-Cornell Institute and our celebration of our 10th year anniversary. I'm absolutely delighted that the speaker today is Rikin Gandhi. Rikin Gandhi is the founder and CEO of Digital Green. I'm a really big admirer of Rikin. I have seen Rikin's work from when it was, Digital Green was a small startup in India to becoming a global enterprise. And Rikin has had an enormous influence in digital technologies and the role of digital technologies in agriculture. And he was working on digital technologies before it became fashionable. And I suspect he had a role to play in making it fashionable. And I'm really happy that he's going to talk to us and give us his vision of what he's been able to achieve and where digital technologies are going into the future in helping smallholder agriculture systems improve and helping livelihoods of small farmers and empowerment of marginal communities and marginal farmers. Rikin, without further ado, let me hand over to you, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Professor Bengali. It's great to be with all of you today. And of course, really want to celebrate 10 years of Tata-Cornell Institute. I remember when Prabhu was just getting it off the ground, and we've had so many exchanges out in the field, and I really so value our collaboration over the years as well. And thank you so much for inviting me to present our work at Digital Green and this journey that we've been on of trying to support small-scale farming producers across various parts of South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. A real core ethos for us is really to see how can we leverage technology to elevate the voices of these individuals and really bring them closer to our food and agricultural system. And so often technology and data can sometimes be a tool that can exploit or disempower people, but our interest is really to see how it can improve the efficiency, the impact, the agency of these individual farming community members and the groups of these individual farming community members that are beginning to come together in various parts of the world so that they can better collectively negotiate with the marketplace and ultimately increase their sustainability as individuals and as communities. What brought me to this work was I have a background in computer science and aerospace engineering, and growing up, I was inspired by watching some of the Apollo era footage of astronauts on the surface of the moon, and those grainy videos is what's had me study science and engineering. And I landed in 2006 in rural Maharashtra, India, with some friends who were trying to start up a biodiesel venture. And although that venture failed within its first 6 months, the opportunity that it presented to me was to meet these farming communities and to see that there was a small minority of farmers who saw agriculture as a source of prosperity, had a good house, were sending their kids to school, while the vast majority of these farming communities were trying to exit out of agriculture as quickly as they could, and really saw it as a vocation of last resort. And I was really able to see, just as those astronauts who brought together brains and brawn and were such a source of inspiration for me, I was equally inspired by meeting these farmers who also were bringing together their brains and their brawn for trying to bring about their livelihoods, to be stewards of the land, and to be as sustainable as possible. So of course, the focus for us is the small scale producers, who are of course the majority of farmers still in the world, and who are confronted by all sorts of challenges, from the increasing variabilities of climate change, to the reality that most agricultural labor has been done by women and is increasingly done by women. And yet they're the ones who have the least access to land tenure or to technology. And of course, with the dynamism of marketplaces and the volatility that we're seeing, whether from COVID supply chain disruptions or the fertilizer constraints, are obviously creating huge challenges for these individuals. And again, our goal really is to see how we can put farmers really first, and see how technology can increase their agency and their voice. The three big sort of enabling factors that we see as enabling the ability for these groups to now grow as farming community members individually, as well as at a collective level, is one, Digital Green has been using videos that have been produced by farmers to share improved practices in collaboration with various government extension programs. Ministries of Agriculture, Ministries of Rural Development in India and Ethiopia and Kenya and the like have large field forces on the ground. In Ethiopia, for instance, there's 70,000 development agents of the government, 3 per Kabele, who are conducting field demonstrations and farmer field school types of training programs for farming community members. And they're spending $150 million per year just on their salaries alone. But in collaboration with organizations like Digital Green, we've been able to improve their efficiency by using videos that are produced by and for farmers to share those very same practices and in some cases improving on those same practices, and being able to see the impact of these practices increase, both in terms of take up by these farmers on their farms, as well as at a systems level, drive down the cost for what typically can cost $30 to $40 to get one farmer to adopt one new practice through these physical demonstrations, wherein experts and farmers are trucked in, with now these videos driving that cost down to $3 to $4. So that work has now scaled to more than 3 million odd farmers, more than 75% of whom are women. And that's created a bit of a digital layer on top of these in-person trust networks and extension systems that the government largely has mobilized, and has also brought together small community groups of women self-help groups or farmer development groups who serve as the primary forum, who are watching these videos every fortnight in sync with the cropping season and location where they're based. And what's interesting is the first 2 questions that people ask when they watch these videos is typically not about the economics or the return on investment about them, but rather, what's the name of the person in the video and which village is he or she from? That's that local trust of somebody that I can relate with and say that if they can do this practice, that I can too, is really the social network, essentially, effect that we're trying to build upon. The second big pillar for us is that a lot of these farmer groups, both the smaller self-help groups, as well as farmer development groups, as well as the larger institutions, are increasingly connecting with sources of financing or funding, typically from these very same government programs that often have World Bank support behind them. They receive seed capital or funding to be able to invest in the savings and credit programs that some of these groups are involved in, as well as into the development of collective assets that can create more of a value proposition for why even be part of a group versus just doing my own individual transaction with the marketplace. And then the third big pillar for us is we really want to ensure that digital data and technology is something that vests in its ownership to the communities themselves, and that the data is not something that Digital Green or any other third party becomes the broker of, but really is something that the communities themselves can steward and can consent to determining who they want to share their own data with, and on their own terms and with their own data protection rules that they want to have enforced. So maybe just to bring a bit of this more to life, as I mentioned, the first sort of component of our work that we've been doing with these more than 3 million farmers, primarily across India, Ethiopia, and Kenya, but also in some other parts of South Asia and Africa, has been really to strengthen government extension programs that have these boots on the ground, that are training farmers through farmer field schools and demonstration plots, and where they've mobilized these smaller associations of farmers, whether they're common interest groups or self-help groups, to be involved in some microcredit or savings programs to begin with, and where they have these frontline workers or village resource persons who have mobilized those groups and are conducting these training programs. What we then do is to train them to produce these videos and to share these videos in those very same group fora, and where data and feedback is collected about who watched what video, what questions they had, what practices people did or did not do. And that's really where we saw both the scale and also this efficiency gain of 10x improvement in the cost per adoption of these government extension systems is functioning with these farming communities. What we're now trying to do more of is that, obviously, with the challenges of climate change and the dynamism of even the marketplace, there's a real need to make these messages, including in video form, a lot more targeted. And it can't just be sort of generalized at a district or a block level. Obviously, there's farmers who are in different types of terrain or in different types of soil condition. And so what we've been working on is to see how we can customize more of this messaging that builds on some of this work that we've been doing around videos by and for farmers, but adding integrations with data sets like soil map information and irrigation map information, so that farmers of one particular soil condition or one type of irrigation condition can get more of a targeted piece of advisory. And also, on the flip side, to also share this data and feedback from these farming communities back, not just to the extension system, but also to researchers and to modelers. And this is, in fact, even some of the work that we're doing in collaboration with Cornell, is to see how some of these practices related to improving yield scale, the greenhouse gas emissions, with improvements on targeted fertilizer recommendations and irrigation recommendations, how that can also inform modelers of some of these climate smart practices. The other big sort of shift for us is that, as a result of some of the disruptions that took place during the COVID era, and also just the reality that tech penetration has continued to expand really substantially, especially in some markets like India and Kenya. We're also seeing a lot of these farming communities come online onto platforms like WhatsApp, and they're already part of these organic groups that they've set up amongst one another to share information. And what we're now doing is to enable these farmers to also share information with each other over these platforms, with things like a scorecard for farmers to benchmark themselves vis-a-vis their peers about what fertilizer did I apply and what was my yield scale emission return versus perhaps my peer. Really basically going even more granular than what our traditional video-based approach was of using videos by and for farmers, taking that one step even further lower to these individual farmers to share information and benchmarks with one another. So where we've reached is, so far since we began, initially we started as a research project at Microsoft in Bangalore. Our name, Digital Green, comes from the fact that we partnered with an NGO called Green Foundation outside of Bangalore to begin with, and we were adding the digital layer. Since then, we ended up partnering with a bunch of great NGO partners, from Pradhan to IDE in various parts of India and South Africa, and then have partnered very closely with these ministries of agriculture and rural development, and seen these increases through various randomized control trials that several of our research partners have been able to conduct with us, both in terms of increases at income at an individual farmer level, but also in terms of changes at a system level in terms of driving greater cost effectiveness of these systems. And going forward, there's, as Prabhu mentioned, there's been such a explosion of entrepreneurial activity in the agri-tech space in India, in Kenya, and many other geographies. And it's obviously extremely exciting. There's tons of new talent and new financing that has come in. Literally more than $1.5 billion of venture capital investment has come into India for the agri-tech space over the last 3 years. And there's more than 1,500 odd agri-tech startups now. And what we see is that there's really an opportunity to have a step change with respect to the ability to both reach a lot more farming communities and also to increase the impact, because one of our reflections has been is that, of course, extension services are really important, but of course, extension can't be just done on its own. Information needs to be coupled with other parts of the value chain, whether it's access to input or credit or offtake, for that information to have tangible value. And so that's really a big thrust also for us, is to make those connections. Not that Digital Green can obviously do it alone. We're going to partner with a bunch of these new actors who are now on the block, so to speak, to get more of this collective impact to take place. But we really want to maintain really this focus on building up these women groups' empowerment and building up their resilience, especially in the face of climate change. Of course, there's a whole host of organizations that have supported this work, from the Ministries of Agriculture and Rural Development, as I said, in India, Ethiopia, and Kenya, and a whole host of philanthropic and research partners over the years. So going forward, the big focus that we've got is still to put our emphasis on the use of these videos by and for farmers, obviously as such a visual vocation, and the resonance of videos in these communities, but even more generally, even for all of us who are online, we still see a huge role for community videos, albeit in new modalities, leveraging new channels like WhatsApp. And the other big thrust that's shifting for us is a lot of these farmer organizations that started off as these smaller self-help groups of 15 to 25 members are increasingly being aggregated into larger farmer producer organizations or cooperatives, which typically will have 500 to 1,000 members, and are run by a board of directors who is elected by these farmers themselves. And so it's a really great sort of opportunity. But the reality is a lot of these farmer groups, perhaps only 10 or 15% of these groups are actually successful, while the vast majority are mostly just on paper. And what we see as a real need is to go below the surface of these farmer organizations, those apex governance bodies that are run, again, by these farmers themselves, to see how they can better coordinate and communicate with their own membership to really drive engagement within these groups, such that the groups can build up their wherewithal to be able to ultimately engage with the marketplace, which is, of course, their primary purpose of existence, is to increase the collective negotiation capacity of these otherwise small-scale individual farmers. So that's what we're now working on, which is to build on the historical work that Digital Green has done with these smaller farmer groups of self-help groups and the like. And now these very same government extension programs, the Ministries of Agriculture and Rural Development, are trying to aggregate these smaller groups into these bigger federations and cooperatives and organizations, and where there's a bunch of action that is taking place in especially the agri-tech startup scene, which is trying to engage with these farmer organizations. There's various groups in places like India and Ethiopia that are trying to provide access to finance to some of these groups, access to offtake markets, access to inputs of seeds and fertilizers and the like. But there's still a need, again, to go from those apex bodies of these farmer organizations to the individual membership or the shareholders of these farmer organizations to drive engagement with them, to drive the value proposition of them, such that you don't end up with what so often happens, which is the shareholders feel that perhaps I was put on this group on paper, but I don't really see much value from it, and I'm just going to go and do my own sales and transactions with the marketplace individually. But what that leaves on the table is obviously the opportunity for these farmers to be able to aggregate and have the benefits of bulk purchasing or bulk sales as they negotiate on the marketplace. The other kind of like big issues, obviously, in these farmer associations is issues of elite capture that can obviously take place in the governance of them. Issues of lack of capital. If they don't have a strong value proposition of having a storage facility or a processing unit, then or logistics facility, then there's not a clear pull for why these farmers should individually kind of collectivize into the group. And then the third big area is this issue around communication and coordination. And what's pretty exciting is that when you go out to the field, as I did, I was just in Hazaribagh, Jharkhand, a tribal state in India, in the kind of eastern part of the country, is that there are these farmer producer organizations that these very same departments of rural development have helped to aggregate from the smaller self-help groups of women. And they are now these women-led farmer producer organizations. And in one of these most low-income type of demographic states, every single one of these women farmers who are part of these groups are on WhatsApp and having their own smartphone. And they've created groups where the group leaders are sharing opportunities to their members about what seeds do people want to purchase or what offtake do they have ready for the farmer producer organization to procure. Certainly, there's still needs for some of these groups to get a leg up with having the bandwidth and the financial wherewithal to even have the appropriate staffing to be able to engage with their membership. But we also see an opportunity to increase the efficiency of these interactions by templatizing how they both share information and opportunities to the members and how members share their demand for what they want out of their group. And so we've been building various types of WhatsApp chatbots and templates to ease the way in which these interactions happen between the apex leaders of these groups and the individuals. And this is, of course, especially a real need for these most marginalized types of farmer groups, which in most cases are still at a very early stage of nascency as it pertains to those groups that are involving women, since there's a lot of capacity building and financing that is required to build up their own wherewithal. Too often, these board of directors of these farmer producer organizations are volunteers, and too often they are having to call every individual 500 person member to find out who wants what out of the group, which is obviously an extremely intractable problem. And so what we're trying to do is to see how can we make that whole process a lot more efficient, but still ensuring that like these women really have control over what decisions they want to have as members of these groups, as leaders of these groups. And to kind of bring this to life a bit more, we've been working with some self-help groups in Ethiopia, as an example, in the western part of the country, to both be able to tap into some seed capital that the government, as well as Digital Green, is providing for these groups to build up some collective assets whether that's setting up a nursery for raising tree saplings, or it's hives for a honeybee business that they're setting up next to a forest, or a shed for some of the grain that they're producing. And what we're finding is that just like the graduation method has had such a huge success for individuals to have an asset that they can then get themselves uplifted from poverty. Similarly, these types of cash transfers to these collectives of farmers that can build up their collective assets can really strengthen the value proposition for these groups, build up their commercialization abilities, and enable the individual farmers who participate in them to really say that this is why then I'm working through this group, and how it's better than me doing my own thing. What we have been grappling with, how do we make sure that the role that Digital Green plays is one that is more of an enabler and not one that we're trying to service these farming communities in a dependent way. And in much the same way that Digital Green has approached the way in which we work with our government extension partners, we're trying to apply that in this new stream of work. So in the community video work that we've historically done at Digital Green, it wasn't Digital Green that produces or shows any of these videos. We partner with these government extension programs of ministries of agriculture and rural development who have these large field forces. And then we train them on ways to leverage tools like these mobile projectors that are battery operated, and which they load these new videos via an SD card and then screen them into these small self-help group or other type of farmer associations that they've mobilized. We created templates for how storyboards for producing these videos could be created, and how data can be collected about who watched what video, what feedback they had, what practices people did or did not apply. And then we put that in the hands of these extension agents to then collect. And we put all of this institutionalized within the auspices of these existing government extension systems, so that they were really the ones who would produce and screen these videos and collect the data and analyze the data and feedback coming back from these farmers to inform the next iteration of the videos and information that they would promote. Similarly, as we're now working with these like farmer organizations, we're also not wanting to put ourselves in between to become a broker or a service provider ourselves. There's obviously other commercial actors who are sometimes in that space, which is obviously great. But from the point of view of what we're trying to do, we really want to elevate and enable these farmer organizations themselves. So what we're doing is more leveraging existing platforms like WhatsApp and Telegram that these farmers and farmer groups are already part of, and creating templates for them to be able to push out information and opportunities to the membership, collect data about what the individual shareholder farmers' demands are, and then have an easy way for these Apex governance board of directors for these farmer organizations to have a view or a dashboard of what those demands are, and be able to then make those transactions with the market actors that they might be engaging with, and to build up the capacities of and bandwidth of these leaders of these farmer organizations. Of course, in all these things, it's not always so straightforward to just kind of create a tool and expect that to be sort of institutionalized and taken up. There's obviously a need for bootstrapping. And just as it was with our community video work, where initially Digital Green provided some of the hardware, video cameras and projectors, and some of the incentives for folks in these government systems to do these video production activities before the government was able to really change their budgetary processes and their performance management systems of their own staff to really factor that in and take over all those costs and operations on their own. Similarly, with this work that we're doing with these farmer organizations, we're in a bootstrapping phase at the moment where we are equipping them at times with hardware like a smartphone if they don't have one already, some access to capital if they don't have that seed funding to begin with, and in some cases even providing some staffing of a data officer so that these groups can get off the ground as it relates to digitization and data. But then the expectation, just as it was in our work with these government extension systems, is that as these groups build their maturity, that they can then take over the costs and the operations of this work. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Here. Sorry. And so hopefully this is still sharing. So oh, sorry about that. Let me just reload. The last component that I wanted to hit on is right here. Okay, so the third component of our work that we're trying to drive at is to start with these like smaller groups of farmers, the 20 to 25 folks who are gathering to exchange information and watch videos, then coming together as these larger associations of collectives, and driving engagement between those board of directors and those 500 to 1,000 shareholders that these cooperatives or farm producer organizations have. And the third piece is to support these groups and collectives to better engage with the wider ecosystem of financial providers or input providers or offtake buyers in a way that protects their interests, especially as it relates to their own data. And so we have built an open source data exchange protocol that's called FarmStack, and working with groups like the Agricultural Transformation Institute in Ethiopia. What this has enabled is for the government and also for farmer groups to be able to publish data about their members, the locations, their contact information. That's in the case of the farmer organizations. In the cases of these government folks, they often have their own soil informations or water or irrigation map type of data sets. And what this FarmStack allows is for the data owner, whether they're a farmer organization or they're the government, to set rules with respect to how that data can be used. Perhaps I'm willing for somebody to use my data for a credit scoring purpose, but I'm not willing for that person to transfer that data to any other third party or to store that data. And so those are the types of data protection rules that FarmStack in software is able to enforce. And tangibly, as an example, working with some chili farmer producer organization in the state of Andhra Pradesh in India, we were able to have this group be able to share its demand for both on the input and on the offtake side of things with some marketplace that exists in India called Calgary, in a way that the farmer organization was able to consent to what data they were willing to have shared, and enable this group to transact with that marketplace while still protecting their data interests. So ultimately, what I think we've found success in overall is really seeing how technology and data can enable these farming networks, both mobilized by the government and of the farmer organizations themselves, to really leverage for themselves and to foster more of this trustful way in which information is exchanged amongst peers that folks are able to recognize as somebody like themselves that they can learn from. And then, of course, these real grassroots level partnerships, farmer groups, government extension systems, that's allowed us to really take a more of a bottom-up type of approach, but marry that with the type of advisory that might be coming out of research, and sharing back the data and the feedback from the communities to inform those models or those research agendas. And really putting these farmers at the center of all that we're up to. And with that, I'll conclude to see what questions and thoughts all of you have. But thank you again for this opportunity, Professor Bengali. It's great to connect with all of you today.
Thanks, Rikin. That was a great overview of the work you've been doing and your vision for moving forward. Digital technologies is becoming such a big thing now, and you were at the forefront of this effort. And so I think there are lots of lessons that can be learned from your work looking ahead. While we wait for questions, let me ask you how you monitor the adoption of practices that Digital Green promotes, and how do you assess the impact of your work?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the primary way is through these extension systems and these extension agents at the village level. So they're responsible for facilitating the screening of these videos, both through these in-person screenings that are taking place using mobile projectors, but also now that they're distributing these videos over WhatsApp groups. And then they're also responsible for physically observing what practices farmers did or did not apply by observing on these farmers' fields which of these practices these folks did or did not do. And so there's, for each video, basically there's a set of parameters that define what are the quote unquote sort of non-negotiable components of those practices and what are those kind of flexible components of them. And yeah, they then vet those. And then there's obviously some kind of cross-validation schema. And the other thing I'd also mention is increasingly now we're trying to engage the farmer organizations to help with this exercise of monitoring what practices farmers are adopting. And in some cases, they need to do this because a buyer is requiring certain types of good agricultural practice specifications to be followed for their purchase of a particular commodity that they might be interested in. And so that's, I think, the big shift for Digital Green, which is for very long, Digital Green has primarily anchored on these government extension systems as the primary anchor from which we're improving the efficiency to reach more farmers and who can then adopt practices in greater mass. But the shift is really to see how can we have more of these farmer organizations themselves be more in the driver's seat. Still, they're going to need support, obviously, from like the government extension system and the like. But yeah, that's really where we'd like the ultimate future to lie with.
Do you see any questions from within this room here? While we think, let me ask you one more.
Yeah.
You've actually started, from scratch. You were an aerospace scientist and decided to get into digital technologies for agriculture.
Yeah.
And now you become like the global face of digital technologies. Can you reflect on, the lessons you've learned, and can you reflect on, what advice you'd give others who are starting in this space? There are lots of people starting in this space, and what would you tell them as you look forward?
Yeah, I think the main thing for me would be just the huge value and importance of immersion amongst these communities. There's obviously no substitute. Reading research papers or participating in these webinars is a good way to get a taste of things, but just spending time out in the field, I think, is the most critical thing. And the number two I'd say is coming from like an aerospace engineering background, people will often say, rocket science is hard, but I think this space of food and agriculture and nutrition that, of course, the Tata-Cornell Institute is so much at the forefront of, is a very complex sort of nut with lots of varying tensions that are obviously not mostly technological in nature. So much of this is social and political and cultural. And I think those dimensions can, one, only begin to be better understood through immersion. And number two, are really intractable to expect that one singular organization is going to be able to affect. And I think that would be my second point, which is just the real importance of partnership with organizations and individuals who have the competency and experience in the field is critical to any new venture to get off the ground in this space.
Absolutely. I see several questions that have come up. Let me read them. I can read them out for you.
I got it. Yeah, I can read it.
You can read them.
Yeah.
So the first is from Kiera.
Kiera, thanks for your question.
About how to integrate data from digital maps.
Digital soil maps. Yeah, Kiera. So so that work is already happening. It is related to our video work, both in India and in Ethiopia. So there's some data, like for instance, like in Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Soil Information Service, which is housed under the Ministry of Agriculture and the Agricultural Transformation Institute. That data set has a bunch of sensitivity around it. It's actually quite hard for folks to gain access to it. And what we're doing basically is to leverage FarmStack, which is this data protection protocol, to enable the government to share that data with, in the case of Ethiopia, with CIAT, the member of the CGIR. And they are then able to couple that soil information with some farmer profile information about their farmers' location, gender, commodity of focus, to then provide more site-specific fertilizer recommendations. And the way that those recommendations are going out is today through, in the case of Ethiopia, via in-person video screenings, since there's not a ton of smartphones in Ethiopia, and data connectivity. So that's going asynchronously over the traditional in-person video screenings, but in a more customized way, to say that in some particular locations, urea or DAP of this quantity needs to be applied at this particular time. And another place might get a different recommendation, both through the videos as well as over IVR, interactive voice response. So also in Ethiopia, the Agricultural Transformation Institute runs this farmer hotline that has more than 3 million unique callers. And so that same system we're leveraging to, again, couple this farmer profile information with the soil map info to then push out more site-specific fertilizer recommendations. And then we're actually working with Cornell in the case of Bihar on site-specific fertilizer and irrigation recommendations in the state of Bihar to address how we can have better yield scaled greenhouse gas emissions based on what types of recommendations go out. So yeah, it is coupled with our video work, to answer the question.
And Rikin Kiera is doing her PhD thesis work also in Bihar, so she may be getting in touch with you on that.
Oh, that'd be great.
At some point. And the next is from Tanu Chawla, and specifically on FarmStack and how do you use that and raise awareness. And I think to add to that, how much of the research community is starting to use FarmStack in their research?
Yeah, also a great question. So I'd say that in the beginning of FarmStack has been around for like the last 3 years. In the beginning, it was quite challenging actually, because we ended up with like a chicken and egg situation, which was we were trying to deploy it in Ethiopia. However, there wasn't like a great recognition or existence of digitized data. And so in the case of Ethiopia, we ended up having to bootstrap that process a bit by actually helping the government to digitize some of their own data. For instance, digitizing their 70,000 extension agents' data about who are these 70,000 people, what's their education qualifications, their location, whether gender, their location, their contact info. Yeah, that was like one stream of work. And then also similarly for farmers, there wasn't also a ton of data about farmers. So we've ended up working with the Ministry of Agriculture to build a farmer registry that now is also capturing data about who are the farmers that this extension system is trying to serve, their location, their crops and livestock of interest and the like. And so as we've been building up some of those digitized data sets on perhaps, I guess you could call it like the delivery side, then the value proposition of integrating those more end user type of data sets with more of these upstream data sets, one might say, about like soil information or weather information, how those two could then be brought together to give more customized advisory. That value proposition then became a lot clearer. And so that's kind of where we are now, because we ended up having to kind of digitize some data sets, show the value proposition of data integration, and then show that the government and the Agricultural Transformation Institute in particular, being the steward of said network, to make sure that both the farmers as well as the government's interests and sensitivities around how data is shared can be protected. As you might be familiar with, there is similar conversations that are taking place also in India, with the Ministry of Agriculture having an architecture that they call agri-stack. It's still very much at a conceptual stage, but they're grappling with also these issues around data exchange. The Indian government has a bunch of data about farmers through the various subsidy programs that they run, including their PM Kisan program that gives kind of cash transfers to farmers. And then there's obviously other actors who want to tap into that to offer their own services or advisory and the like. But there's a real need to think about how does that exchange happen in a way that protects the various interests that are there. As it relates to researchers in particular, I think researchers, obviously want data for like developing their models to come up with recommendations. I gave the example of SIAT in Ethiopia, and that's how we're sort of like plugging in research to come in to help to drive the value proposition of these data integrations.
Great.
Yeah.
And then the next question is from Vanisha Sharma. She's a PhD student with us here and just spent a year experimenting with WhatsApp groups in India.
Oh, cool.
So she predictably has a WhatsApp group question and very specifically interested in your scorecards and using scorecards as the benchmark engagement. And can you elaborate on how farmers on the groups growing different crops can benefit from scorecards with different fertilizer, pesticide use, etc.?
Yeah, so the way that the scorecard thing has been working in the state of Bihar has been that the farmers are not actually inputting the data directly. It's the village resource persons of the Department of Rural Development or Jivika in Bihar that is recording that data about what fertilizers are these farmers applying, and then what is the corresponding yield that these farmers are then getting. And so then what happens is basically like that data is inputted by these village resource persons, and then these scorecards are generated around at an individual person level, being able to compare themselves with like the average fertilizer use and yield of farmers in their sort of community or village. And so Yeah, I'd say that like it sort of builds on the work that Digital Green has been doing with videos. The videos thing is like actually somewhat similar, albeit not like so quantified, right? In that you're showcasing a fellow farmer applying some practice, sharing their testimonial about what return that gave them. And then you're sharing that sort of benchmark, so to speak, or scorecard, albeit in some like video testimonial demonstration format to fellow farmers in their vicinity. In this case, we're getting more granular, trying to get like more detailed information about how much, exact quantities of fertilizer or irrigation use these farmers applied. We have not done it for pesticide, I guess. It's just focused on fertilizer and irrigation use. And then enabling these farmers to kind of compare themselves to the average of farmers in their area.
Great. And it looks like Tanuj has a follow-up question. One of your slides, you shared the FPO pages where FPOs can update public information about their produce commodities. Is that information public or is it only shared? Oops, I lost. With certain stakeholders.
It's the latter. So yeah, so as I mentioned, our main thing is not to be the brokers of these farmers' information or just to like make it all public, but to allow these farmer groups to decide who they want to share what data with. Because sometimes, you might think that like, well, what do people care about like sharing their chili harvest publicly? But they might care because that's not just like the volume of their production. It often will have like a tag of also what's the quality of this chili harvest. And for some folks, maybe they want to not share the fact that they may have had a B grade harvest this season to the world at large. They might just want to share that with the B grade chili purchaser. And so that's the kind of customization of data protection and sharing that FarmStack allows the data owner, who in this case is the farmer producer organization, to determine.
Great, thanks, Rikin. And I'm sure Vanisha will get in touch with you. She has lots of questions about digital technology, WhatsApp use, etc. And your advice would be very useful to her also. As you can see, we in Cornell, there's lots of excitement around research on digital technologies. And so, oh, here's another question from inside our own group.
It's impressive presentation. And you mentioned Bihar a couple of times in your work, so it looks like you work a lot there. What's your opinion on digitization in Bihar? How far is it, but just starting to emerge, or is it well underway, or is market being saturated, or so can you elaborate a little bit more about what is the current situation specifically in Bihar?
Yeah, I'd say it's like
and where do you see like in the next 15 to 20 years?
Oh yeah. Well, 15 to 20 years, they'll definitely be saturated. I think in the current phase, I'd say that it's definitely well underway, right? It's definitely not like totally uniform. Obviously, like women still have like lower access to their own devices and having even like their own confidence to leverage these devices for purposes like agriculture. But it's rapidly changed, right? From obviously you're probably familiar with like what's happened with Jio, right? Reliance Jio telecom network in India has just really decreased the prices of both connectivity and devices, such that like all these people, especially during COVID disruption, increasingly came way more online. I'd say that probably for the women farmer groups that we work with in Bihar, it's around like 60% or so of those people have their own individual smartphones. So it's not like everybody, but it's a lot of people relative to a couple of years ago. And then there's a bunch of like service providers who are in the ecosystem who are trying to do like agri-tech plays from the commercial side of things with very significant sums of venture capital backed money. In the state of Bihar, the most well-funded agri-tech company is called Dehat, which has raised, I think, about like 150 maybe million bucks so far. And so there's a lot of players. And you know, the reality, even for those kind of commercial backed ones, is of course that they're not also thinking about things just purely like on a digital, or I'll just use an app and people will come kind of thing. They certainly need to be, and they are thinking about hybrid sort of operational models, right? So in the case of like Dehad, they're primarily like a input provider plus credit provider, and in some case even like purchase offtake. But so what they have are physical centers. In their case, they have set it up as like a franchising kind of model, wherein Dehat kind of has these operations in the field that the farmers can come up to, and then they can order it with some support from these like in-person people, right? So I think that that's like really exciting. I think that there's a real need to ensure that what's happening on the commercial sort of like venture-backed space has some degree of balance with what can be built up of these farmer organizations like wherewithal. Because I do think that there's a risk like if you think about like in the 10 to 15% 10 to 15 year horizon, that if a single company just like took over the whole input sort of business or supply chain of a state like Bihar, and then had the ability to sort of set price, there could be real ramifications on that. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing, because like, you know, people are definitely getting access to quality and timely inputs today at better prices. But like, I think our version of what we'd like the future to be is like a healthy balance between what the commercial venture-backed companies are able to offer in terms of service or product delivery, and what the farmers and farmer organizations wherewithal is to be able to negotiate with said players in a way that, you know, results in more win-win type of outcomes, as opposed to like a single player only winning.
Great. Thank you, Rikin. This was really a great seminar and a good discussion. As you can see, there's a lot of interest here in Ithaca. And so next time you're in this region, please come by and visit us, spend some time with our students, and give us more of your knowledge and advice on this topic.
No, thank you for inviting me. Yes, and I'd encourage all of you to check out the work in the field, and we are certainly very excited about hopefully building on our collaboration with all of you at the Tata-Cornell Institute.
Thank you so much, and look forward to being in touch again. See you then. Bye-bye.